legitimate in the beginning, when asserting a true artist could not compromise with the world of money, the principle became false with the subsidiary belief that an artist could assert himself only by being against everything in general. Consequently, many of our artists long to be exceptional, feel guilty if they're not, and wish for simultaneous applause and hisses. Naturally, society, tired or indifferent at present, applauds and hisses only at random. Consequently, the intellectual of today is always bracing himself stiffly to add to his height, but as a result of rejecting everything, even the tradition of his art, the contemporary artist gets the illusion that he is creating his own rule and eventually takes himself for God. At the same time, he thinks he can create his reality himself, but, cut off from society, he will create nothing but formal or abstract works, thrilling as experiences, but devoid of the fecundity, I can't say that word. I think it means devoid of the meaning we associate with true art, or the feeling, which is called upon to unite. In short, there will be as much difference between the contemporary subtleties or abstractions and the work of a Tolstoy or a Molière as between an anticipatory draft on invisible wheat and the rich soil of the furrow itself. In this way, art may be a deceptive luxury. It is not surprising then that men or artists wanted to call a halt and go back to the truth. As soon as they did, they denied that the artist had a right to solitude and offered him as a subject, not his dreams, but reality, as it lived and endured by all. Convinced that art for art's sake, through its subjects and through its style, is not understandable to the masses, or else in no way expresses their truth. These men wanted the artist instead to speak intentionally about and for the majority. He has only to translate the sufferings and happiness of all into language of all, and he will be universally understood. As a reward for being absolutely faithful to reality, he will achieve complete communication among men. This ideal of universal communication is indeed the ideal of any great artist. Contrary to the current presumption, if there is any man who has no right to solitude, it is the artist. Art cannot be a monologue. When the most solitary and least famous artist appeals to posterity, he is merely reaffirming his fundamental vocation. Considering a dialogue with deaf or inattentive contemporaries to be impossible, he appeals to far more far-reaching dialogue with the generations to come. But in order to speak about all and to all, one has to speak of what all know and what of the reality common to us all. The sea, the rains, necessity, desire, the struggle against death. These are the things that unite us all. We resemble one another in what we see together, in what we suffer together. Dreams change from individual to individual, but the reality of the world is common to us all. Striving towards realism is therefore legitimate, for it is basically related to the artistic venture. So let's be realistic, or rather, let's try to be, if this is possible. For it is not certain that the word has a meaning. It is not certain that realism, even if it is desirable, is possible. Let us stop and inquire first if pure realism is possible in art. If we believe the declarations of the 19th century naturalists, It is exactly reproduction of reality. Therefore, it is to art what photography is to painting. The former reproduces and the latter selects. But what does it reproduce and what is reality? Even the best of photographs, after all, is not a sufficiently faithful reproduction, is not yet sufficiently realistic. What is there more real, for instance, in our universe than a man's life? And how can we hope to preserve it better than in a realistic film? But under what conditions is such a film possible? Under purely imaginary conditions. We should have to presuppose, in fact, an ideal camera focused on the man, day and night, and constantly registering his every move. The very projection of such a film would last a lifetime and could be seen only by an audience of people willing to waste their lives in watching someone else's life in great detail. Even under such circumstances, such an unimaginable film would not be realistic, for the simple reason that the reality of a man's life is not limited to the spot in which he happens to be. It also lies in other lives that give shape to his, lives of people he loves, to begin with, which would have to be filmed too, and also lives of unknown people, influential and insignificant fellow citizens, policemen, professors, invisible comrades from the mines and foundries, diplomats and dictators, religious reformers, artists who create myths that are decisive for our conduct, humble representatives, in short, of the sovereign chance that dominates the most routine existences. Consequently, there is but one possible realistic film, the one that is constantly shown us by an invisible camera on the world screen. The only realistic artist, then, is God, if he exists. All other artists are ipso facto unfaithful to reality. As a result, the artist who rejects bourgeois society and its formal art, who insist on speaking of reality and reality alone, are caught in a painful dilemma. They must be realistic and yet cannot be. They want to make their art subservient to reality, and reality cannot be described without effecting a choice that makes it subservient to the originality of an art. The beautiful and tragic production of the early years of the Russian Revolution clearly illustrates this torment. What Russia gave us then with Bloch and the great Pasternak, Mayakovsky and Essine, apologies if I pronounce that wrong, Einstein and the first novelists of Cement and Steel, was a splendid laboratory of forms and themes, a fecund unrest, a wild enthusiasm for research. Yet it was necessary to conclude and to tell how it was possible to be realistic, even though complete realism was impossible. Dictatorship in this case, as in others, went straight to the point. In its opinion, realism was first necessary and then possible, so long as it was deliberately socialistic. What is the meaning of this decree? As a matter of fact, such a decree frankly admits that reality cannot be reproduced without exercising a selection, and it rejects the theory of realism as it was formulated in the 19th century. The only thing needed, then, is to find a principle of choice that will give shape to the world, and such a principle is found not in the reality we know, but in the reality that will be, in short, the future. In order to reproduce properly what is, one must depict also what will be. In other words, the true object of socialistic realism is precisely what has no reality yet. The contradiction is rather beautiful, but after all, the very expression of socialistic realism was contradictory. How, indeed, is a socialistic realism possible when reality is not altogether socialistic? it is not socialistic. For example, either in the past or altogether in the present, the answer is easy. We shall choose in the reality of today or of yesterday what announces and serves the perfect city of the future. So we shall devote ourselves, on the one hand, to negating and condemning whatever aspects of reality are not socialistic, and, on the other hand, to glorifying what is or will become so. We shall inevitably get a propaganda art with its heroes and villains, an edifying literature, in other words, just as remote as formalistic art is from complex and living reality. Finally, that the art will be socialistic insofar as it is not realistic. This aesthetic that intended to be realistic, therefore, becomes a new idealism, just as sterile for the true artist as bourgeois idealism. Reality is ostensibly granted a sovereign position, only to be more readily thrown out. Art is reduced to nothing. It serves, and by serving becomes a slave. Only those who keep from describing reality will be praised as realists. The others will be censored with the approval of the former. Renown, which in bourgeois society consists in not being read or in being misunderstood, will in a totalitarian society consist in keeping others from being read. Once more, true art will be distorted or gagged, and universal communication will be made impossible by the very people who passionately wanted it. The easiest thing when faced with such a defeat would be to admit that so-called socialistic realism has little connection with great art, and that the revolutionaries, in the very interest of the revolution, ought to look for another aesthetic. But it is well known that the defenders of the theory described shout that no art is possible outside it. They spend their time shouting this, but my deep-rooted conviction is that they do not believe it, and that they have decided in their hearts that artistic values must be subordinated to the values of revolutionary action. If this were clearly stated, the discussion would be easier. One can respect such a great renunciation on the part of men who suffer too much from the contrast between the unhappiness of all and the privileges sometimes associated with an artist's lot, who reject the unbearable distance separating those whom poverty gags and those whose vocation is rather to express themselves constantly. One might then understand such men, try to carry on a dialogue with them, attempt to tell them, for instance, that suppressing creative liberty is perhaps not the right way to overcome slavery, and that until they can speak for all, it is stupid to give up the ability to speak for a few at least. Yet socialistic realism ought to own up to the fact that it is the twin brother of political realism. It sacrifices art for an end that is alien to art, but that, in the scale of values, may seem to rank higher. In short, it suppresses art temporarily in order to establish justice first. When justice exists in a still indeterminate future, art will resuscitate. In this way, the golden rule of contemporary intelligence is applied to matters of art. The rule that insists on the impossibility of making an omelette without breaking eggs. But such overwhelming common sense must not mislead us. To make a good omelette, it is not enough to break thousands of eggs, and the value of the cook is not judged, I believe, by the number of broken eggshells. If the artistic cooks of our time upset more baskets of eggs than they intended, the omelette of civilization may never again come out right, and the art may never resuscitate. Barbarism is never temporary, Sufficient allowance is never made for it, and quite naturally from art barbarism extends to morals. Then the suffering and the blood of men give birth to insignificant literatures, an ever-indulgent press, photographed portraits and sodality plays in which hatred takes the place of religion. Art accumulates thus enforced optimism, the worst of luxuries, it so happens, and the most ridiculous of lies. How could we be surprised? The suffering of mankind is such a vast subject that it seems no one could touch it unless he was like Keats, so sensitive. It is said that he could have touched pain itself with his hands. This is clearly seen when a controlled literature tries to alleviate that suffering with official consolations. The live art for art's sake pretended to know nothing of evil and consequently assumed responsibility for it. But the realistic lie, even though managing to omit mankind's present unhappiness, betrays the unhappiness just as seriously by making use of it to glorify a future state of happiness, about which no one knows anything, so that the future authorises every kind of humbug. The two aesthetics that have long stood opposed to each other, the one that recommends a complete rejection of life and the one that claims to reject anything that is not real life, end up, however, by coming to agreement, far from reality, in a single lie and in the suppression of art. The academicism of the right does not even acknowledge a misery that the academicism of the left utilises for ulterior reasons, but in both cases the misery is only strengthened at the same time that art is negated. Must we conclude that this lie is the very essence of art? I shall say instead that the attitudes I have been describing are lies, only insofar that they have but little relation to art. What then is art? Nothing simple, that is certain. And it is even harder to find out amid the shouts of so many people bent on simplifying everything. On the one hand, genius is expected to be splendid and solitary. On the other hand, it is called upon to resemble all. Alas, reality is more complex, and Balzac suggested this in the sentence. The genius resembles everyone, and no one resembles him. So it is with art, which is nothing without reality, and without which reality is insignificant. How indeed could art get along without the real, and how could art be subservient to it? The artist chooses his object as much as he is chosen by it. Art, in a sense, is a revolt against everything fleeting and unfinished in the world. Consequently, its only aim is to give another form to a reality that is nevertheless forced to preserve as the source of its emotion. In this regard, we are all realistic and no one is. Art is neither complete rejection nor complete acceptance of what is. It is simultaneously rejection and acceptance, and this is why it must be perpetually wrenching apart. The art constantly lives in such a state of ambiguity, incapable of negating the real, and yet eternally bound to question it in its eternal unfinished aspects. In order to paint a still life, there must be confrontation and mutual adjustment between a painter and an apple. And if forms are nothing without the world's lighting, then in turn add to that lighting. The real universe, which by its radiance calls forth bodies and statues, receives form from them at the same time a second light, that determines the light from the sky. Consequently, great style lies midway between the artist and his object. There is no need of determining whether art must flee reality or defer to it.